Welcome to the Maths and Goodman Masterclass series. Today's Masterclass is designed to help you understand the intricacies of the valuation of developments, and today's expert is Tom Norfolk, an RICS registered valuer with almost 20 years experience as a consulting valuer. Tom heads up our valuation team in the South.
Hello, today I'm going to give a talk about development appraisals. It's an important thing for valuers and their assessment of development sites, and also for the option for viability analysis too. We need to make a distinction within looking at a development appraisal between what is a viable project and what is actually used in a residual analysis of valuation. So the first point that I'm going to talk about is the difference between what is an option analysis or a viability analysis and what is actually a residual appraisal. On the screen there's a fairly, and it's the underlying background for an appraisal. But what we have here is the basis for the assessment, whether that be for a viability or whether it be for a residual analysis. If I just talk about the components here, we'll go on to elaborate as to how they're used within viability and within residual appraisals. But we should know that GDV stands for gross development value. If you're taking the project costs out of that, an element of profit, and the land value, you should get to an answer of 0. Now within a viability analysis, if the answer is negative, then that obviously means that a project is unviable. And what happens there is that there needs to be testing done with the various inputs, whether that be GDV, whether it be costs, level of profit and so on, in order to get to what would be a viable project. And I suppose the idea really would be, in a subjective assessment, which is done by investors, by developers, is to make sure that that number is as positive as possible. Now the way of really doing this, and it's something that is done very readily, but it's sometimes applied in a cash flow or a DCF approach, is that there will be various analyses on growth inputs within the calculation, on the timing or the phasing of a particular project, and actually also the financing level. But when we get into these inputs and testing of these inputs, we are very much getting into a subjective assessment, and whereby that means that we're providing, if a valuer is doing this sort of work, then they're effectively doing a worth calculation. But it's a very valid thing to do for project analysis and option analysis. If the answer to that equation is 0, then that is what we would consider to be the mean position, i.e. the wider market is likely to converge at this point for a particular development or a particular opportunity, i.e. the wider market being numerous bidders. So this is where a residual valuation sits. What we could term it as in basic terms is it's an all risks approach. Though, when a valuer is doing residual calculation on a development appraisal for a particular instruction, whether that be for loan security, whether it be for option analysis or for internal reporting, they need to think very carefully about what inputs they're using within those calculations. Say the adoption of costs, who've that been provided by, how's it tested, and then the need to check against their experience under the schemes or the indices that are available to us. And that goes into testing the results. And we do talk about doing sensitivity analysis, and that's quite important within the checking of our calculations. Now with residual appraisals, they will usually contain a very regularised set of assumptions, and those components should be common across the majority of the residual appraisals that you will see in a valuation context. There will be elements for professional fees, for agents' fees, for marketing, project timing, finance and so on, that should be laid out in a very similar fashion and should also be within various parameters that I'll go on to talk about, that should show that there's been appropriate consideration to come to this all risks approach. We're going to talk about components and assumptions within a residual appraisal. We've listed here some of the key ones, the most influential on the results within a residual valuation. We've got build costs, contingency, and professional fees, and statutory elements. Within build costs, we would be referring to BCIS data, but we would also be benchmarking against information that's provided by a client or a borrower. Within build costs, there's also elements for demolition, for site clearance and remediation, enabling works, or maybe even specific utility elements, things like putting in extra power or data even. Within contingency, we put a guide there of what element of contingency should be within a project, between 5 and 10%. Now this really does depend on the project complexity, or the type of project it is, or even the stage within the process of that project. Similarly with professional fees, there is a range there, and it relates exactly in the same way to what stage the project's in, its complexity and so on. Now with the statutory considerations, whether that be section 106 or SIL or SIL, there may be information that is very specific to a project that's part of the planning permission that's already been secured on the project. But in other cases, that calculation will have to be done, or that there will be information that we can use from previous projects to benchmark for a particular project. If we go on to talk about the other elements that are slightly less influential in the result, but also they are key and they need to be there within calculations. There's the idea that we need to have some sort of cost of sale. Now, whether that be for the completed development, or it needs to be for unit sales, or whether it needs to be for investment, is still an important allowance because they do have an influence on the GDV. There is also finance. Now I'm going to talk a little bit later about the finance element, but within the residual valuation, this is effectively seen as the opportunity cost of the capital that goes into the project. Now very important within a project is obviously profitability. In a simple way, there is an element of risk that needs to be represented with every project, and the element of profit, the level of profit within a project, will dictate as to how risky really the valuer sees the project as being. And there should be some explanation behind what level of profit is put in there. But typically we would expect to see between 15 and 25%. Again, this does depend on the project complexity and so on. And then lastly, within the component, there is the residual land value. There is the final element. Within that, there should be an allowance for land tax, and there also should be some sort of allowance for purchase costs. So this is the site purchase. This isn't the sale at the end of the project.
We've talked about the components and assumptions within development appraisals. But this is a word of advice for those that are reviewing an appraisal, especially when it's provided by a valuer. It's really important to check that all the components and assumptions are accounted for. And you need to challenge whether any missing elements are actually whether there are any unusual assumptions. Valuation reports should back up what is within the calculation, but in essence it is best to check the components within the calculation to make sure that they accord with the general assumptions that we've talked about.
I'm going to now focus on the allowance for risk within a particular appraisal. The assessment of risk in an appraisal will be covered by four main components. Principally the profit element, which we've already discussed already, the level of contingency, the timing of a particular project, and actually the allowance for stamp duty within the calculation. That's sort of an end allowance. But there also needs to be a very, very specific allowance and consideration for whether a site has planning or not. So planning risk and hope value. So when a scheme has no planning permission at all, but the assessment of risk needs to be made, there needs to be an adjustment for planning risk. Now this is an important adjustment. This is something that is basically judgment based, but if a site has no planning permission, it can't really be appraised as having zero risk of not getting planning permission. So another very basic equation really, value with planning permission less some end allowance gives you a value without planning permission. Now that end allowance is very much judgment based, but it's a very important consideration. And there are all sorts of things that would influence that end allowance. One of the main things that we do come across quite regularly are sites that have had pre-app planning applications are put in. We can see correspondence associated with that. There's usually some very detailed plans. there's probably some costing that goes into that. But more importantly, there is typically feedback from the local authority as to the response to those pre-apps. And it's very important within a calculation, within an assessment of value for a site that doesn't have planning permission, but is really in the planning process, that that information is made readily available to a valuer in order to help make the right level of adjustment associated with what is the actual risk in not getting planning. So we have to base that judgment on various factors, but those factors are not something that we can apply a particularly quantitative rates to. But typically you should see an allowance for planning within a calculation of between 10 and 50% for a project that has got some potential for planning, but there isn't a really positive pre-app there, or the pre-application process hasn't even started. But schemes with really, really good potential should be, the planning risk adjustment should be fairly low. Now, schemes with permitted development potential is a slightly different consideration. And again, these typically will be less adjustment than a speculative assessment of a planning permission. But there still should be some there, because permitted development rights are typically difficult to achieve on viable projects for a range of reasons. So we're going to talk about hope value. Now, there are quite a lot of discussions regarding hope value, and its inclusion within valuation reports should be fairly limited. The discussion should be around it being used as a check. It needs to be just purely an analysis. Hope value, you would say, basically, is to do with the element of uplift that's associated with not having any planning potential whatsoever and having planning on a particular site. It's very, very subjective, but it should be used as a test on the existing use and as to how it changes the analysis of a particular, whether that be a particular project, whether that be the initial yield, whether it be the rate per square foot. But it is only purely a test. It shouldn't feature particularly in valuation reports unless it is specifically discussed as a test. The last element I'm going to talk about is the time value of money consideration within a project, within a residual appraisal. The assumption within the calculations is that a project is effectively 100% equity funded. Now, this means that the application of finance costs effectively represents the opportunity cost of capital. Currently, we would expect to see within a residual appraisal an allowance for finance between 5 and 6.5%. Now, this does depend on a number of elements, similar to the allowance for profit, similar to the allowance for professional fees. But we would typically suggest that that rate is analogous to an equated yield that would be applied within a DCF calculation. Now, in the real world, outside of producing residual appraisals, we would expect to see very specific finance costings, definitely across development finance, but also the structure of deals as such, where there are joint venture agreements, there's profit share agreements, all as a mixture of all of these things. They are very individual and very specific to particular projects and particular operators, whether they be developers, property funds, or propcos. But if we are applying very specific elements within financing in a project, we are going back into providing a worth calculation and effectively doing an option or viability analysis. So just in summary of what we've been over within this presentation, we've hopefully given you an understanding of the fundamental structure of an appraisal. The two applications of this, whether this be for option or viability analysis, or whether it be for residual valuations. We've gone over the key and core components that you need to see within those calculations. We talked a little bit about the allowance for risk and where that comes within a particular project. We talked about planning risk, but also about hope value and as to what exactly that should be and how it should be considered, and also the time value of money considerations, which are really very specific to residual appraisals.
Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about the valuation of developments or you require professional advice, please contact Tom Norfolk. His contact details follow.